what's going on with the big, beautiful bill? And are the mistakes that Republicans are making with their big spending bill related to the mistakes that the Biden administration made with their spending packages post-COVID? Joining this episode are Jason Furman and Ben Ritz to discuss budget issues and what's going on with Trump's big, beautiful spending bill, as he calls it. Jason Furman is an economist at Harvard University, and he was the chair of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 2016. Ben Ritz is the vice president of policy development at PPI, and he is our resident budget wonk, budget guru. He's been on the show many times before. And these gentlemen join the show today to discuss what's going on with the budget, where we are in the Senate, what this is going to do to America, what the negative effects might be, and ultimately how we got here. As always, thank you for listening. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Get access to bonus episodes of the show, get access to cool swag, our community, all of that, much more. We appreciate your support. Now let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today are Ben Ritz and Jason Furman. Ben and Jason, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so I think where I'd like to start here is not actually with the big, beautiful bill that's passing through Congress right now, but I'd love to start with a little bit of historical context of kind of how we ended up where we are today. I would love to talk about kind of the Biden administration's approach when they first passed their own BBB. The Biden administration had the Build Back Better agenda, and now Trump is countered with a different BBB, the Big Beautiful Bill. But to understand why the Big Beautiful Bill is potentially so bad, I think we have to go back to the Biden administration and talk about the Build Back Better agenda. So, Jason, I know this is something you've written about before, but how do you think about Biden's agenda when he was elected, and in particular, the big spending bills that were passed? What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And how did they kind of lead to the current moment?
In some sense, you need to go back even further. You have Bill Clinton balances the budget. That leads to much larger tax cuts than you otherwise would have had from George Bush. You then have Obama does temporary emergency spending unpaid for, but everything else in his agenda, most notably the Affordable Care Act, really is paid for. The deficit comes down over that period, and then Trump comes in and does a large tax cut, in part because the deficit had come down and there was some more fiscal space. So you now have Biden coming into office. The economy is recovering rapidly, but there's still a lot of nervousness around COVID. He does that first big bill, the American Rescue Plan. It appropriately was not paid for. It inappropriately was much, much larger than it needed to be for the moment. And then after that, there's the sort of uneasy, we should pay for things, the type of rules Democrats had before, but with a lot of Democrats saying, you know what, Republicans haven't done this. We don't want to be suckers. And by the way, interest rates are pretty low. And so things like BBB for the Democrats, in theory, were going to be paid for. But in practice, the infrastructure bill and CHIPS weren't really paid for. The climate bill up front was deficit increasing at the very least. And the legislation that the House passed on BBB did some of the types of gimmicks that we're seeing the Republicans do now, where certain things were overstuffed by making them end after, a year or two or three. So you didn't have their full cost over the 10-year window. So with Biden on fiscal, you had this sort of mixed combination of lip service to the fiscal responsibility, while in practice, an awful lot of stuff was added to the deficit. By the way, I would add student loans to all of that.
And you could also throw chips in there, which was hundreds of billions of dollars in that bill as well. And it strikes me when I look at these kind of things that it feels like we're always fighting the last battle to some extent. Like we learned our lessons from the previous war, we learned from our sins, and now we're going to invent entirely new sins. During your tenure and really during the Barack Obama presidency, we recovered from the Great Recession over the course of those 8 years, but there was very much a sense that we didn't do enough, that the recovery was too slow. It feels like we got almost a decade of commentary that, the response in 2008 and 2009 was not big enough and we should have gone bigger. And to me, it seems like that attitude really like reared its head in 2020. Like the biggest sin we could have is to not go really big. Do you think that's kind of an accurate summation, or is that a factor in kind of how the Biden administration was thinking about these kind of things?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on simultaneously. One is absolutely, I think we did too little in 2009. The economic team at the time wanted to do more. I think the constraints were Congress. Other people may have other theories as to what the constraints were. But at least as far as the economic team is concerned, we should have done more. And then we ended up doing too much in 2021, and that was overlearning the lesson. That's one stream of all of this. There's then a second stream of all of this, which is just, do you want to be the people that are fiscally responsible and hand over something great to your successor? Or does that make you the sucker who, makes the mistake of restraining yourself just to give more room and space to the next person? And, that was a second thing that I think was going on in the Biden administration. And look, I don't think it's totally crazy. Had Biden balanced the budget, we'd have even more tax cuts under President Trump right now. So why should you balance the budget if all that means is the next person gets to decide what to do with the money? So I totally get that, relate to it, sympathize, but it's not a great way to run the country if we do it that way over and over and over again.
I think I agree with everything that Jason just said. The only other thing I would add is, we should think about what role a lot of these fiscal policies played in the election outcome. I don't think this was entirely a fiscal policy election. I mean, obviously it wasn't. But it's one thing to say if Biden balanced the budget. And I know we're being hyperbolic here because there's no way we were actually going to balance the budget 4 years after COVID, given everything, given the fiscal situation as it was inherited. But let's say Biden balanced the budget. Do we actually think there would be a President Trump, or would he be handing a balanced budget over to Kamala Harris? I think there's also an important question that needs to be asked, and part of the conversation is how did these fiscal policies potentially contribute to the fact that we got a second Trump term to begin with?
Yeah, and Ben's making a really important point here. I mean, I was framing it and I think misframing it, and Ben is right to call me on that, as you're leaving a problem to your successor. What do you get when you have high deficits? You get higher inflation. You also get higher interest rates on things like mortgages. Both of those are incredibly unpopular with people. And so, it's not free money. When you give out $500 billion of student loan debt relief, if all that was making a bunch of people $500 billion better off, great, go ahead and do it. But it's making some other people worse off. And those other people might be someone who's paying more for something they're buying, might be someone spending more on their mortgage, might be someone who needs their taxes increased or something down the road. And when you factor all of that in, these trade-offs and constraints are, not just about the future. Some of them bite in the present.
To some degree, thinking about economics is just learning how to think about trade-offs. That's something I remember like learning in Econ 101 class in college where I had a really good professor. And by the way, this is total side note, but Jason, I love that at Harvard, you now actually teach basically their version of Econ 101. I feel like we need more talented professors doing that it shouldn't just be the thing that gets shunted onto some junior professor. So thank you for actually teaching Econ 101. We need more of that. But not to get sidetracked by that. But yeah, it's when you think about the role of like deficit spending, we have all this deficit spending, we have national debt, and there are times that can be useful, right? There are times when you're recovering from a steep recession, when that kind of thing is really helpful. But then there are times, when you're at full employment, when the economy is already humming along, you're just thinking about a trade-off. You can spend money on whatever you want, but it's going to mean that inflation goes higher. It's going to mean that interest rates go higher. And part of me wonders, again, I like to frame these things in historical sense. Did we, like, as a political class, simply forget how much people hate inflation? We hadn't had really serious inflation since like the early 1980s. And I wonder, if there was some sort of deliberate decision, like we're going to run the economy really hot. And if inflation goes up to 3 or 4%, whatever, that's not a big deal. And no, it turns out like we totally miscalculated because people really, really hate inflation.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems we had here coming out of the COVID recession wasn't just that we got the policy wrong and the size of the policy wrong, but it was that the administration didn't really even try to get it right. When there were concerns raised about the size of the package and, is this going to potentially spark inflation? Is this well in excess of what we need to support the economy through the pandemic? There wasn't a big discussion about what the consequences were or could be. It was just this focus of it's better to do too much than too little, and not actually thinking about, well, but how much could we be doing too much and what could the consequences of that be? And I think that decision stemmed almost entirely from a downplaying and a forgetting of just how politically unpopular and economically damaging that periods of high inflation could be.
Yeah. And look, in defense of the Biden administration, it's not like the Fed was forecasting inflation. It's not like financial market pricing was forecasting inflation. It's not like the Congressional Budget Office was forecasting inflation. So an awful lot of people extrapolated off the previous decades to think that would continue. That's usually a good way to think. Most of the time, if something's happened for 20 straight years, you should think it's going to happen again next year. It just doesn't happen when you have structural break type policies. And that's where you need a certain amount of theory, a certain amount of models, maybe a certain amount of historical experience and wisdom. And that can be a little bit hard. It's, I do want to get to the present at some point, and Jeremiah, whatever your timetable for that, is great. In some ways, it should be more obvious now that we're an economy at full employment. The debt is much higher than it was back then. Interest rates are much higher. And so, it's, and inflation still hasn't come down below, at or below the Fed's 2% target. So in some ways, it's even more inexcusable, the error that is being made with the one big, beautiful bill right now.
Mm-hmm. And just to put a bow on the Biden stuff, I mean, I fully understand why they made some of the decisions they made, maybe not in exactly the detail that they made them, but I understand the instinct to go big because I lived through the 2010s and we had, it felt like unemployment would tick down like 1% a year. It would go from 8% to 7%. Then another full year would go by and maybe would get it down to 6.5%. And I understand why they wanted this recovery to be a lot faster, a lot bigger. But as I said, we're always fighting the last war. And in this case, Trump seems to he's fighting a totally imaginary war against something that I'm not sure even exists. But so let's talk about the big, beautiful bill now. we're now in the situation where, thanks to decades of deficits and decades of this, and the actions of what happened under Trump and under Biden, we've now got a very large national debt. We're in a worse fiscal position than we've been in a long time. Can you give us, Ben, the basic breakdown of what is actually in the big beautiful bill that is now passed the House and is being considered in the Senate? What would the big beautiful bill actually do in terms of spending, deficit, debt? What likely impact would it have on inflation, on the economy? Let's set the level here of what's actually going to happen.
I think for me to actually describe what's in the big bill would probably take the rest of this podcast. It's over 1,000 pages, and there's quite a lot of policy in there, from tax policy to spending on security issues to just a bunch of unrelated stuff like AI regulations. So I can't go into details on everything that's in it. But kind of the top line is, it would increase deficits over the next 3 years, over the next decade by more than $3 trillion as enacted. But a lot of those policies are scheduled to either have delayed starts or early expirations, not because these are intentionally temporary policies, but because they are gimmicks designed to make the policy look less expensive over a 10-year budget window. So, for example, Trump's no tax policies from the campaign on tips and overtime, et cetera, are only in place for his administration 4 years rather than the full 10-year window. And so if these policies were actually made permanent, then we're looking at more than a $5 trillion deficit increase. So it's pretty significant in size. It is more expensive than BBB, the Biden BBB would have been had it been enacted similarly. And I think it would be by far the most deficit increasing party line reconciliation bill ever passed.
Yeah, I mean, part of the tragedy of the one big beautiful bill is there are meaningful spending cuts in it. But those spending cuts are, first of all, starting with the poorest and most vulnerable, rather than people who could afford it. And second of all, they're not part of a collective sacrifice for deficit reduction. They are to pay a portion of the cost of the tax cuts in that bill. And so we're saying, they're effectively saying, poor people are going to pay for part of the cost of tax cuts for the rich, and the rest of the costs of those tax cuts. And there's ones for the rich, there's ones for the middle, there's lots of tax cuts in there. The rest of those costs will be higher mortgage rates, higher inflation, higher taxes in the future, some combination of all of that. That's basically the structure of all of this, and it's being done at a time that is increasingly precarious for the U.S. debt market and the global economy.
It really does seem like I wish we had a healthier politics where there are some people who want a bigger government, some people who want a smaller government, and that's natural, but that the people who want the bigger government would fund it with more taxes in an honest way. And the people who want a smaller government would actually cut, that the size of their cuts would equal the size of their tax cuts would equal their spending cuts, rather than this, as you've said, we're going to do 1 trillion roughly in spending cuts and then use that to finance 5 trillion in tax cuts. And so the deficit only ever goes up. I mean, I guess it really is kind of that dynamic of, the deficit will be somebody else's problem in 4 years and I'll be out of office. And so who cares? It's very cynical to think that way, but that appears to be the dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's the dynamic. And as Ben highlighted with the Biden stuff, financial markets don't wait 4 years to react to something. It will change and shape mortgage rates today. It will have some impact on inflation today. So some of these costs are costs that are shifted to the future. Some of them are born in the present. The issue, though, is what exactly the magnitudes of those costs in the present are. You can think of fiscal policy through the types of standard models. And those models tend to be linear. So, you do a change and some other small thing happens on the other side. You do a medium change, something medium happens on the other side. But then there can also be nonlinear dynamics. That's what the United Kingdom experienced under Liz Truss. Her mini budget at the time was about 1.5% of GDP per year in tax cuts. This is about 1.5% of GDP per year in net tax cuts above the spending. And so the magnitude here is the same as Liz Truss. Liz Truss led to this sort of nonlinear panic, almost crisis-like dynamic in the UK. We haven't had that in the United States. I am not predicting that we are going to have that, but we're raising the chances of it and flirting with it and taking a risk. And you take a risk over and over and over again. And, one of those times it's not going to work out.
It's interesting how all of this comes in the wake of the 2024 election, in which inflation was such a big issue. Trump gets elected on a wave of kind of discontent, many things. I don't want to simplify the 2024 election to just one issue, but I will say clearly one of the, say, 2 or 3 biggest issues, without question, was the state of the economy and most of all, inflation and, cost of living. And many people describe that as a crisis, and Trump promises, we're going to go back to 2018, 2019, when things were fine. And a lot of people just seem to have that view of like, yeah, what if we just went back to when Trump was president in 2019? That was all fine. And so he gets elected kind of on this wave of discontent with inflation. He promises to fix it. And now he's, going to potentially really, really drive inflation even further if macroeconomic theory holds. Passing a gigantic deficit bill when we're at full employment, that's an inflation accelerating thing to do. And I guess my general question here is this just like a genuine rejection of economics from the Trump administration? Is this, economics is fake and we don't believe it? Is it just a bet that, by the time the problem gets here, I'm going to be out of office, so I don't care? Part of me thinks that, the cynical thing is true, but part of me thinks there's just a large part of our politics that doesn't believe economics is real to some extent. And we see that a lot in many different parts of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to believe that they're taking their economists very seriously. Because if you had a serious economist, they would be telling you not to do this type of legislation, not to do the tariffs the way they're doing them. There's an issue with the feedback mechanism. The price that people care the most about is the price of gasoline. That's the one you see printed in huge numbers and you pass it every day as you're driving. Gas prices have come down. That actually is in part because of the tariffs. Why? Because the tariffs are weakening the global economy. I mean, the global economy is weaker. The thought is everyone's going to buy less oil and the price goes down. And so some on the inflation side, ironically, some of the immediate feedback loops have been to sort of calm people down and make them temporarily not worried about inflation. But yeah, I think we're going to see more of it later this year. We're going to see it next year. And the sort of low gas price honeymoon we're going through right now will at some point be a memory.
One of the interesting things you mentioned, Jason, and either you or Ben could take this, but I'm curious how you think about the feedback mechanism from markets and how that might influence what politicians are doing here. And this is a little bit speculative, I know, because none of us have views inside the Trump administration with great clarity. But one of the things that is, for instance, a dynamic in Trump's trade policy is the idea of taco, that Trump always chickens out. And famously, somebody has even repeated this phrase to Trump himself and maybe destroyed the global economy by doing so, by letting him know that this is a phrase. But it really does seem that, when the bond market in particular gets scared because of something to do with tariffs or something to do with whatever, that Trump notices. And it honestly doesn't surprise me because Donald Trump is a real estate guy. He knows what the bond market means for big construction projects, certainly, and for the general state of the economy by comparison. So I'm curious, do we think that, if the big beautiful bill gets close to passing, will we see a market freak out, number one? And number two, does that have any chance of influencing the way people are thinking?
So, this is the linear, nonlinear thing. On the linear thing, markets have anticipated the big beautiful bill. They've priced it in already. And, the path it puts us on might raise interest rates by 2 or 3 basis points a year. After a decade, they're maybe a bit more than that. After a decade or two, maybe interest rates will be a percentage point higher than they otherwise will have been. But it's a long, gradual process, one that's already been a lot built in. There's always this risk of a nonlinear dynamic. The thing is, I don't think the taco applies here, at least to Trump, in the way that it does to tariffs. Tariffs, he can, on a whim, on any given day, raise them or lower them. And he's done that over and over and over again. He's raised them, he's lowered them, he's raised them, he's lowered them based on feedback. Legislation, especially a big piece of legislation like this, is sort of like a super tanker, and you're steering it. The idea that he would just, after praising the House bill, all of a sudden say, I'm not in favor of this, you can't do this, or you need to cut the tax cuts or something. I don't see him doing that. Now, it's possible others will. It could be that some of the senators who are insisting on fiscal discipline would look at the bond market, look at their worries, and act. But I don't think Donald Trump is where the restraint is going to come from.
Yeah, I would just also add, Trump has not shown, when it comes to fiscal policy, that he is fiscal and monetary policy, that he's particularly attuned to market signals. He did kind of get it with the collapse of the bond market during the tariff liberation day stuff. But, when inflation's been a problem, or whether it's not been, his answer has always been, tell the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates because he wants lower interest rates. And when you see higher inflation and higher inflationary pressures, that wouldn't be the reaction. So, I think he's going to do the fiscal policy he wants to do, and he is going to do that regardless of what the market says.
The interest rate thing is so fascinating to me because we've already run this experiment, right? There's a kind of this crank, heterodox, very fringe view of economics that says, actually, if your central bank lowers interest rates, that will make inflation go lower. And this is not what standard macroeconomic theory says, but there's a small handful of people who believe it. And I believe it was Turkey that has been trying this. Erdogan in Turkey, he's consistently tried to push the Central Bank of Turkey to lower rates. And of course, Turkish inflation exploded because of that. But that just, again, signals to me this idea that there's no macroeconomist anywhere in the room, or it's certainly not one that has any sort of standard training or just normal things to say when Trump is saying, my solution to inflation is to lower interest rates.
I can't not take this opportunity to ask this question. Jason, have you considered the possibility that raising rates might move inflation higher?
No.
Was that Stephanie Kelton, that whole episode?
Yes.
Funny thing is, then she referred me to a paper that she claimed showed this. It turns out the paper said the exact opposite of what she said the paper said. Moreover, the paper was basically making an assumption rather than showing anything of anything. And so it turns out if you spot check some of the MMT work, it is published in an obscure journal, done in an obscure way, and then doesn't even say what they claim that it says. And I assume an awful lot of the other stuff would work out that way too, but I don't tend to spot check most of it. The good news here is we have an independent Federal Reserve. The Supreme Court has effectively reiterated that it's going to protect the independence of the Federal Reserve. The president can yell and shout all he wants about lower interest rates. That creates some uncertainty. It has some economic cost, but I actually don't think it's huge because they are insulated. Now, we should constantly be nervous about that independence of our central bank. President Trump, my hope is, will appoint someone good to be Fed chair. I mean, I'd actually love it if he reappointed Jay Powell, but I don't think that's in the cards. But that would be a great choice from my perspective.
Can I ask a technical question here, Jason? Because Powell's term does end like most of the way through Trump. Like I think it's like January 2028. Jerome Powell's term ends as the head of the Federal Reserve. And so there's danger that Donald Trump appoints somebody like kooky or crazy or whatever. But in technical terms, like when the Fed votes, it's generally as a as a body, as a board of governors or whatever. So if there's just like one crazy person who's the chair, but everybody else stays relatively sane, can they just consistently overrule the chair? Is that? I'm asking if I should have some hope here, basically.
Yes, they can. Let me correct you a little bit on the dates. Jay Powell's term as chair of the Fed ends in the beginning of 2026. His term as a governor of the Fed ends in the beginning of 2028. The historic tradition is if you're not reappointed as chair, you would give up your governor slot. And so the president could appoint a new governor and appoint them as chair. Even if for some reason Jay Powell didn't give up his governor slot, there's another governor slot, someone named Adriana Kugler, that comes up next year. So in the normal course of business under the law today, Donald Trump will get to appoint a new person and confirm a new person to be both a governor and chair of the Fed in the beginning of 2026. Now, historically, generally people have reappointed their predecessor's pick. And in fact, Jay Powell was his own pick originally. So I wish he would do that. But under the law, it is totally appropriate for him to pick a new chair in 2026. But then as you got into with the voting, the crazier his pick is, the less likely his pick could get anyone else on that 12-person committee to vote with them. And so he has a choice. Pick a crazy person and they'll just be a lone voice in the wilderness, creating a lot of uncertainty in the process. Or pick a respected person, a steady hand, in which case they probably can bring the committee along with them, but they'll only be able to do that if they're not doing crazy things like dramatically cutting interest rates to bring inflation down.
So taking a left turn, and that does soothe me a little bit, Jason, but taking a left turn, one of the things that you guys have mentioned already, and kind of the state of the big, beautiful bill right now, is that it is passed the House by one vote, I believe, and it is now sitting in the Senate, and it's appearing to have some difficulties in the Senate, where Republicans have a 53-47 edge, I think, and the problem seems to be that there are at least a handful of Republicans, certainly not the majority of them in the Senate, but a handful that are actually worried about fiscal sustainability and about adding, $4 or $5 trillion, however you want to measure it, $2 or $3 or $4 trillion to the deficit, depending on how you count. Ben, you might have some insight here, or Jason, maybe you would as well, but what do we think the odds are that the Senate actually makes what I'm just going to call improvements to this bill? I don't think it's a great bill either way, but certainly, if we do tax cuts or spending cuts and we pay for them, it's better than doing a lot of tax cuts and just not paying for them at all, maybe. So, Ben, what are you hearing about, the actual chance that something good happens in terms of not adding all these trillions to the debt?
I want to disabuse you of the idea that the Senate is going to make this bill better, at least from a deficit perspective. They might make it better in terms of the composition of tax cuts. So, for example, House Republicans place a higher weight on repealing the SALT cap or raising the SALT cap, which is a pretty regressive tax cut that mostly benefits the affluent. They are much more wedded to Trump's stupid campaign proposals, like the no tax on tips, whereas the Senate is not as much. Meanwhile, the Senate is more focused on certain tax changes, like immediate deductions for R&D that are actually relatively pro-growth as far as tax cuts go, and actually could be economically beneficial, especially if they were paid for. So I think the composition of the tax cuts might get a little bit better. But as this debate has been going on, I mean, it's worth remembering when the budget resolutions were first being considered, the House only had the votes for a $2.8 trillion deficit increase, while the Senate passed a budget resolution that would allow a $5.8 trillion deficit increase. And they wanted to use the current policy baseline scoring gimmick that would basically say extending all of the expiring Trump tax cuts is free. Doesn't cost anything, even though every bill in the modern budget process is scored against a current law baseline that says if you vote to extend an expiring tax cut, that is a cost because you have voted to cut taxes relative to what they would be if you weren't voting to cut taxes. And so the Senate is actually not where the fiscal hawks are. They will make changes, but I don't think they will be the saviors of our fiscal trajectory.
Right. And part of the issue here also is just the ability to use gimmicks. So if you make the tax cuts, end a year earlier, you can lower your 10-year number, but you haven't really done anything to help our fiscal trajectory. So the Senate might also have more appetite for gimmicks than the House, and the House's appetite for gimmicks was already very, very high.
Jason, you've talked a couple times now about what you call nonlinear effects. And, this is basically what I'll say in less polite terms, the collapse of the existing order to some extent, that things go into a panic. And maybe those words are a little bit loaded, but, that something stops going from a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse, and then you snap your fingers and all of a sudden it's a lot worse very fast. And you're kind of warning that this kind of dynamic could happen, and we don't know exactly when it could happen, but once it happens, it could be pretty bad. The questions I would ask are, what are the warning signs we would get before that? Would we have any warning, or would it come so fast that there would be almost no warning? And how likely do you think that is that we hit that kind of tipping point in the next 4 years? Or is that something that's more likely to be 10 years out? And obviously we're making speculative guesses there, but what's your broad sense there?
Yeah, I've been studying the experience in other rich countries. And the problem is there just aren't a lot of precedents for a country that is the world's reserve currency, that is borrowing in its own currency, in charge of its own monetary policy, fiat money, etc. There's just not a lot of historical parallels. That shouldn't give us much comfort. I mean, we've seen things in Canada in the 1990s, interest rates spiked. I think they went up 3 percentage points. I mean, so could you imagine mortgage rates all of a sudden going up 3 percentage points? And that happened very quickly. In the United States, in some sense, this happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, and their interest rates sort of went high to fight inflation, but then rather than recovering, they sort of kept creeping up to some degree, at least real interest rates, inflation-adjusted interest rates did. So there was more growing over time. Canada, it was fast. The United States has also defaulted in the past. We think that doesn't happen, but we had promised to repay gold in the 1930s. We said we weren't going to repay in gold. We were going to repay in dollars, and we made the dollars worth less. We effectively inflated away a bunch of our debt after World War II, again in the 70s and 80s, and again in COVID. And so the timing of this could be fast, could be slow. And if it happens, it won't just be because we did one fiscal thing. It will be the worry that we're doing another fiscal thing after it, and we're attacking the Fed, and we're doing a crazy tariff thing, et cetera, et cetera. It will be a broader set of institutional concerns that all add up to the problem.
That broader set of concerns is really what worries me, that we could survive, it seems like, one of these things. If Donald Trump just kind of wants to light the international trade order on fire, as long as nothing else was broken, that would be bad, but like we could get through it. If they were adding a bunch to the deficit, but doing a bunch of other smart things, maybe we could get through that. But, the fact that we are, doing what we're doing with regards to immigration and the mass protests around the country and destroying international trade and, ruining the fiscal outlook for the country and ruining our international reputation and flirting with all sorts of other weird stuff that might, health-wise, we're unprepared for the next pandemic. Like, all of it at once just really makes me worried about the, as you called them, the nonlinear dynamics. And it seems like we're in a much more fragile, vulnerable place that, if there's a tipping point, we're kind of leaning over and it's much easier to tip us because of all these things happening at once.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that, we don't talk about very often, and I don't think this is, the most important factor contributing, but, let's think about the first round of Trump tax cuts and what they did to the deficit and how that played into the inflation we experienced under Biden. I think that the Biden fiscal policies would have been less inflationary had they been enacted at a time the deficit was lower and we didn't have the ongoing Trump tax cuts adding to the deficit. And so I think, the way these policies build on each other in a way that makes them more problematic than even they seem at the time they're enacted is underappreciated. And if we take, not just these deficit increasing policies, but then the trade policies on top of the deficit increasing policies, that you're now talking about two inflationary forces building on each other. You put all these together and the problem gets worse than it can possibly be by doing any one of them on their own. And so I think you're very right to be concerned about that.
I think it's kind of a very cliche thing to compare everything to Argentina, right? The economic basket case of the world up until very recently, and I mean, arguably still, but I really do wonder, like, is it just inevitable that we have this long, slow walk into becoming Argentina, in the sense that, well, the inflation for this might not hit until a few years in, and there's no incentive to do good things now, so I'm just going to do whatever I want, and then the next administration is going to do whatever they want, and if nobody has the incentive to actually take the medicine of fiscal responsibility, is it just inevitable that we're going to kind of very slowly plod our way into higher and higher inflation and worse deficits until we end up at a place that would be, it would have seemed unthinkable in the heydays of the 1990s when Bill Clinton, actually ran some very small surpluses.
Yeah, I think one thing that's this kind of goes back to our earlier conversation about feedback loops. I think one big cause for concern is, do our feedback loops now look more like the Argentinian feedback loops looked like before, where when there were economic problems, instead of saying, this policy caused the problem, let's not do it, just the scapegoating and the blaming of other forces that were used as an excuse to continue doing what we're doing, or what they were doing. I'm concerned about the fact that, if we have higher inflation as the result of deficits, are we going to have the same reaction we did in the 90s when deficits were leading to higher inflation and interest rates, where we had sort of this populist Ross Perot revolt that said, we got to bring down the deficit. Now, the populist revolts are saying, we just need more deficit increasing policies because inflation is because of corporate greed or, various other scapegoats that aren't really the cause of the economic problems we're facing. And so I think one key to not being Argentina is to fix those feedback loops to be how they were. But in the current age, I don't know exactly what that looks like or how to do it.
Yeah. Historically, you saw a pattern. When the deficit went up, you got more deficit reduction. When the deficit went down, you got less. That pattern was broken partly for good economic reasons. When we were coming out of the Great Recession and interest rates were basically zero and demand was really deficient, it actually made sense to not be overly focused on deficit reduction. We're now back to an economic situation more like it was 30 years ago than like it was 10 or 15 years ago. And the question is, our political system is very different than it was 30 years ago, when there was more overlap between, the most liberal Republicans and the most conservative Democrats, when there were more of these types of fiscal deals between, Reagan and Tip O'Neill and the like. And so the question is, how much will the political system changes override the economic changes? Or how much will the political system have to accommodate itself to the fact that we're in a economic reality that does demand more responsiveness now?
I'm going to make an analogy to something I've heard Ezra Klein say about abundance, because I'm very abundance-pilled right now, and I've been thinking a lot about that in addition to what we're talking about today. But one of the points that Ezra Klein makes is that, even if abundance is not the best winning political message, even if it's not the kind of thing you lead with a campaign, that like, oh, we have to loosen NEPA rules so we can build infrastructure faster. Like nobody's making that their presidential campaign headliner, right? But what abundance does allow you to do is to actually get results and then campaign on the results, and if you actually improve the cost of living, make it easier to build housing and people's rents go down, they notice that. And, if there are Democrats listening, and I know there are some, this is my pitch for why you should actually take this seriously, is that, look, it's not the greatest immediate political message to say, well, we've got to make some tough choices because the deficit has to come down. But if voters notice that you are the ones who end up after 4 years with lower inflation, with a lower deficit, with interest rates on your mortgage not going crazy, they will notice. Voters are not, voters can be fickle, but in the end, they're usually not stupid. And the results will speak for themselves. And, that chasing the sugar high of what's good, like right this second, is not always actually the best political strategy, even if it polls better. Even if in a poll, people tell you they want lower taxes and higher spending, they will still punish you for the inflation that follows, right?
Yeah, Jeremiah, I think that's 100% right. And that was a big focus of the paper we published on the topic of the similarities between the Trump and Biden BBBs and the lessons learned last month. Because if you looked at the polling around ARP and the individual policies in Build Back Better that Biden was pursuing, individually, all of them were actually relatively popular, more popular than the Trump bills. But people hated the inflation that came afterwards, and they hated what they saw as too much spending and not any prioritization of fiscal discipline. And so I think, it is a really important point that, it doesn't matter how popular an individual policy polls if the effects of that policy are far more unpopular. And I think that was one of the big lessons we should take coming out of the Biden administration.
Yeah, I agree with all of that.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time soon. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast. And that is, where should people go to learn more? And I will start by recommending that you should read the work of both of our guests, Ben Ritz and Jason Furman. Jason has a piece, I believe it was in the Foreign Affairs, called The Post-Neoliberal Delusion and the Tragedy of Bidenomics. It's a great piece that touches on a lot of what we're talking about today. You should go read that. Ben has a great report out that he just referenced from PPI, how Trump's BBB is shaping up to be an even bigger mess than Biden's. So I'm happy to recommend that you should go read both of our guests. The links will be in the show notes. But Jason, I'll start with you. What, other than your own work, would you recommend for people who are interested in this, for people who want to learn more? What kind of Twitter accounts should they follow? What white papers should they read? Are there books? Are there anything at all that you think would be helpful to people who are interested in this topic?
My colleague Ken Rogoff has a new book called Our Dollar, Your Problem. And it's a terrific history of the global economy over the last several decades. It gets at a lot of these types of fiscal, monetary, institutional, can you count on things? When is there linear? When they're not linear? You get to watch that play out, not just in the United States, but other countries around the world over the last couple decades. So skip Twitter, read a book. That's the book to read.
And Ben, same thing for you. Any recommendations that you'd have for people who want to keep abreast of what's going on with this bill in particular?
Yes, I will echo Jason's recommendation to not get information from Twitter. Could not recommend that one more highly. As far as what to look at, I think there have been some really solid analyses of the big, beautiful bill from the Congressional Budget Office, Penn Wharton budget model, Yale Budget Lab's done some great stuff, and EY had something relatively recently too, all kind of looking at both the debt impact of the bill, but also what it would do for growth. Spoiler alert, it would go down, despite Republicans saying that it would go up and use that to partially pay for itself, and how it would affect inflation. And so I think if you're trying to get a sense of what this bill would actually do, I would look at what those analyses say, both of the House passed bill, and then I'm sure they will do updates for when there's a final bill and something comes out of the Senate.
Hopefully something good will happen with this bill. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case, but I try to be an eternal optimist. And in that spirit, I want to say thank you to my guests for coming on the show. Jason and Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Anytime.